Hi, my name's Abbey Phillipps and welcome to JMM Insights. Today I'm speaking with BlinkLab, ASX code BB1, a company that is developing an AI-powered smartphone-based tool to detect early signs of autism and ADHD. Joining me is Brian Leedman, who is the non-executive chairman. Brian, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Abby.
Firstly, for people who may be new to BlinkLab, how would you describe what the company is trying to change about neurodevelopmental conditions and how they're diagnosed?
So, neurodevelopment conditions and how they're diagnosed, it's essentially all a subjective thing. We have doctors who are making visual assessments of children typically, and it's a subjective test, and that's how all neurological conditions are diagnosed. Subjective is not 100% accurate, of course. It's, one doctor might have a different views from another doctor. Unlike, say, an objective test, which is very much like a blood test. You've got an indication here that says that this is high in a certain value that indicates that this is perhaps a cancer or something else, and so far more accurate. So what BlinkLab have done is created an objective diagnostic test using reflexes as the biomarkers to diagnose neurological conditions. This is based on decades and decades of research, published research, and it came out of Princeton University, exclusively licensed to BlinkLab, using just a smartphone. And so the technology is enormously scalable. And what it also does is it creates a situation where a doctor can assess a child, say, at an age, say, as young as 2 years old, to provide a highly accurate diagnosis of, say, autism or ADHD using just a smartphone. Unlike the current system, which has a massive backlog of concerned parents trying to get their children assessed with limited resources, and results in a child being diagnosed. Typically, the statistics in Australia is somewhere between the ages of, say, 6 and 7. Well, that's pretty late to be diagnosed with something like that. You cannot treat anybody with anything until they're diagnosed. So we all know the earlier the diagnosis, the better the outcome for the patient. And what we promise to do is provide earlier diagnosis using a disruptive technology, which we're developing and is in the late stage of that development.
And then, so BlinkLab has made a lot of progress over the past year. From your perspective, what has been the most important developments for the company?
Well, I mean, there's been so many milestones that we've hit over the course of the last year and a half since we listed on the ASX. Probably the one I'm most proud of is the most recent announcement made, maybe it was just after Christmas, and it was to do with the publication of our clinical study that we conducted in Europe that was published in Autism Research, which is a peer-reviewed journal. A lot of investors and shareholders don't realize the significance of that, but I can tell you, being in my many years in the industry, I can tell you that being published in a prestigious peer-reviewed journal is really important, particularly when it comes to getting your ultimate goal, which is FDA approval. And that's what we're going to hopefully be applying for by the end of this year, or towards the end of this year. And having a publication in a peer-reviewed journal is really, really important for the FDA regulators, because this is their own peer group reviewing and saying that this technology is incredible and what we're doing, and it's published. So just to get published in itself is quite an achievement. So that's probably the biggest milestone I think we've met to date. But of course, getting all the hospitals lined up to commence the recruitment for the autism trial, which we're going to start this quarter, is obviously getting all your ducks lined up to actually have a trial underway as an FDA regulatory trial in North America. And that's where we're about to be, with our first patient about to be recruited. And that means we're then in the game, so to speak, because then we are one of those short list of healthcare companies that actually have an FDA regulatory study underway in North America.
And Brian, as we've mentioned, BlinkLab uses a smartphone-based subjective approach to assessment. What makes it different from traditional diagnostic methods?
Well, I might have touched on this earlier when I talked about subjective versus objective, but in essence, psychiatrists are trained to diagnose neurological conditions, albeit from autism, ADHD through to dementia and depression and all kinds of things. So what we're talking about essentially for BlinkLab using that facial reflex response is essentially this disruptive way of being able to use a biomarker. And the biomarker is effectively your blinking. Like I'm looking at you, and if I was to actually just look at me very closely, and if I was to go like this, right? It's interesting because you just blinked then, right? When I just flipped my thing, and that was done remotely. That is a really basic way to demonstrate how this works. Now, there's a lot more tech than just me making you blink in that way, but there's a whole bunch of stimulus that's been given through the smartphone that the forward-facing camera is then analyzing the child's face. And it doesn't just capture blinking, it's all kinds of things. And does the child sit still? Are they touching their face? Is their heads moving? Are their eyes staying focused? There's a lot of factors that go into the algorithms that we've developed that is very different to the way children are currently assessed in the subjective way through clinical psychiatrists. And of course, clinical psychiatry is a very specialized field. If you want to get a formal assessment, say, of autism for your child, you can't just go to a GP and get a diagnosis. The GP is the gateway to the specialist that allows that formal diagnosis. But the GP can use this product once it's approved it could be in effect like a screening test. It could be that, look, most kids actually don't have autism that come forward for assessment. Most of them actually, there's nothing wrong with them other than maybe being a slow developer. So they get better over time. But some kids, they are autistic, be it mild on the spectrum, and they are not getting diagnosed typically until they're 6 or 7 years old. Now, we can fast forward that and hasten that diagnosis using this technology once it's rolled out.
And then just expanding on that, Brian, so what problems in the current diagnostic process does this technology aim to solve for families and clinicians?
Well, I mean, essentially, it's just it's the backlog. I mean, that is the bit. I read articles in the newspaper all the time and on the news about this frustration that families have in being able to get a formal diagnosis for their child. I mean, the parents know when something's not right. Then they're concerned. And so they're off to see the GP, and the GP makes their own, looking at it, but they're not necessarily the experts in the field. They're the gateway to see the experts. So if we can have a tool that screens children at a young age, you can reduce that backlog enormously if this technology is then adopted. And it's governments that will be the main beneficiary of this because they're paying out for, say, for in Australia, for NDIS. I saw a news article on the weekend that talked about the budget for NDIS reaching currently $46 billion, reaching $64 billion in 2029. I mean, that number exceeds our defense budget. It's just an enormous sum of money. And a lot of that money is being wasted. And this can create a far more efficient process for doctors to be able, GPs, to screen children for the likely signs of autism using this, as long as it's FDA approved, of course. And that's what we're spending our shareholders' money most diligently in getting an FDA approval, which we hope to get by the end of this year.
And how have clinicians and research partners responded as they've started working with the platform?
Well, I guess another thing that I'm enormously proud of in this company is the partners that we have. So if you look at the company announcements, we have now announced 9 clinical partners in North America, ranging from Penn State Medical University to the Kennedy Vanderbilt Institute of Autism Research and 7 others as well, that are just the most prestigious centers for autism research in North America. And that is an incredible achievement on the part of the clinical team at BlinkLab to get such prestigious partners to want to be part of this study and as part of what we will ultimately be submitting for FDA regulatory approval. And of course, having the right partners is really important. So that gives a lot of kudos to the company and the legitimacy of the technology that we've developed. in partnership with Princeton University, of which we have the exclusive license for this technology. And that is what we're putting together. And hopefully we will get a positive outcome from this regulatory study. One thing that's also important to note for your listeners is that we've already done a very substantive clinical study. This was the pilot study we announced the results of in late last year, achieving sensitivity specificity of 85, 84% respectively, as compared to a formal clinical diagnosis by a physician for a child that neither of us know is autistic or not. It's a fully double randomized blinded clinical trial, but it was a pilot trial. We wanted to make sure that the protocols that we put in place for the hospitals to follow could be followed in a hospital environment. And if there's any changes that we needed to make, we could tweak them before we entered into the formal regulatory clinical trial, which is what we're about to begin. But those results on 500 odd kids was outstanding compared to what the FDA have advised us is the target that we need to get, which is 65% or above. So sitting in the mid-80s is well and truly above the target the FDA have said. And what do we have to do now? We're basically repeating the trial. We've got another 500 new kids, again, double-blinded. We don't know who's who in the zoo, but we get to do a trial that is same as the last one. I'm optimistic that we'll get the same outcome.
And then, so once all these regulatory milestones are achieved, what do you see as the key drivers of adoption in real-world healthcare settings?
Well, first of all, it's the partners that we have. So we already have 9. It's quite possible that we'll announce another couple of clinical partners in North America in the coming weeks. They're certainly being in discussion. So let's just say approximately 10. I would likely be the first adopters of the technology. So these centers of excellence in autism research and treatment who are part of the clinical trials, they'll be the ones very familiar with the technology and will make the technology available to them as part of their practice going forward. So having their adoption of the technology, I would imagine, lead to widespread adoption of the technology across the physicians in North America.
And then, so BlinkLab is developing tools for both autism and ADHD. How does the broader platform approach shape the company's long-term opportunity?
Well, it's interesting that, I do talk quite a bit about BlinkLab, obviously with investors, and I often ask the question, what value does ADHD play within the current share price of BlinkLab? And the answer is always uniformly zero, right? So it's all about autism. And that makes sense because that's where the company's discussions and announcements have all been about autism. But the ADHD opportunity excites me tremendously because we're using the same platform technology to be able to diagnose ADHD as we do for autism. And there will be more news flow, significant news flow on ADHD moving forward from here. So that is a market opportunity conservatively estimated at 7 times larger in terms of prevalence than autism. And there's also another aspect to it as well, is that a lot of adults are being diagnosed with ADHD. Now, that's another enormous market, and I like that market because these people can pay for it themselves, as working adults. And there's already treatments available for ADHD in terms of drugs like Ritalin and so forth. So for the drug manufacturing companies, that's an important one because they're in the business of selling more drugs. So if you have a diagnostic tool that can do ADHD as well as autism, then that's a significantly larger value proposition than what we've been putting forward today.
And Brian, I guess we've kind of just touched on this, but just to further expand here. So looking ahead, what type of impact do you hope BlinkLab can have on early diagnostics and access to care?
Well, I'm hoping this is a disruptive technology. And that's what it promises to be. Having a smartphone that can make diagnoses such as these, well, right now it's exclusively on an Apple phone, but we'll be expanding that to Android phones in the near future. But we're talking about something that's software, and I like software. My last company in ResApp Health was a software company, and we were acquired by Pfizer. I like being software versus hardware because it means I don't have to manufacture anything. We develop the software and then it can be rolled out so long as people already have the hardware, and they do because they're already carrying smartphones. Then this can be adopted very widely, but it does depend on one really important thing, and that is regulatory approval, particularly FDA in the United States, which is the entry into the largest commercial market in the world for medicines and medical devices. So, should we get FDA approval, well, then the commercial opportunities will present itself, and that's because it's a disruptive technology that can really hasten the ability for the medical community to be able to diagnose indications such as autism. And as I mentioned at the start of your interview, the earlier you can diagnose anybody with anything, the better the outcome for that patient. In fact, I'll just make one further point. If you look at the enormous expenditure in the NDIS, which is what currently $46 billion, 40% of that is specifically in the field of autism. Now, but if you want to break that down, of the billions that they're spending on autism, most of that is actually for children who become adults, and it's their ongoing care needs is what's chewing up this enormous expenditure. So, of course, their ongoing care needs could be significantly reduced if they were diagnosed earlier and therefore got treatment earlier, then led to later life where they were less reliant on further support. And that is the huge benefit to the governments, who should be very interested in what BlinkLab is doing. And I'm sure they currently are and will be increasingly.
Brian, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your insights into BlinkLab's progress and vision.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.